This was in 2019 when I was 21. I was spending the summer at my parents' house and figured I'd go camping in the woods in their backyard while I had the chance. This was a pretty impulsive trip. I just decided one morning I'd pack my bag and head out for the night. I'd done it a bunch of times before, so this wasn't some special camping trip or anything. I let my parents know where I was headed, then left at 4 p.m. to find a spot for the night. I walked for a good hour before finding an open area that looked nice enough. I got my tent set up, cleared out a space, and lit up a small campfire. It was really cozy, and the sun slowly setting made it even better. Exactly the kind of night I was hoping for. But it really didn't take that long for it to get interrupted. The sun was just about to pass the top of the trees when I heard a voice. A male voice, sort of muttering or talking. I almost felt like it was echoing a bit though, because it was hard to pinpoint exactly where the voice was coming from. It was also dark enough where the shadows from all the trees made it really hard to see much of anything. I probably should have mentioned these woods behind my parents' place were pretty vast and unexplored, as in there were no trails around here. So running into someone would have to be very coincidental. I thought they'd likely just pass by and that would be the end of it, but I continued hearing the voice for probably 5 minutes, which was long enough that it seemed they weren't just walking and were maybe staying near me on purpose. Eventually, I called out, just yelling hello to see if they'd respond. But before I even finished speaking the word, the voice cut out. The forest was now silent. I felt really uncomfortable and ended up calling out again. No voice or response. Now I was a little more on the creeped out side. With only 20 or 30 minutes left of the thin layer of sunlight, I decided I would just move spots. No need to stay there and be creeped out all night and let it ruin my experience. Within a couple minutes, I was heading back into the trees and looking for another place to call home for the night. I didn't have as much luck though. 15 minutes in, with the fading sunlight rushing me, I decided to just settle where I was, basically just among all the trees. It was a good thing I did though, because by the time I finished setting up camp, there was no light left. The sun was fully down, and the woods were dead silent. I found it calming though, knowing I'd be able to hear if that guy came back around, for whatever reason. I built up another small campfire. I enjoyed the warmth for a while, before grabbing my snack bag and taking out some stuff to make s'mores. I got a small stick and stabbed a marshmallow on the top and held it over the fire. I don't know what it was about it, but roasting a marshmallow over a campfire is just one of my favorite things to do. It helped get my mind off of things. I made a few s'mores and hung around the fire for a good long while, several hours at least. It was pretty late by then, and I was letting the fire begin dying out. It was still somewhat bright, but only half as much as it was before. But then I heard the crunch of leaves behind me. I thought it sounded like somewhere to the back left of my campsite. It was completely dark though, and once I was looking over there, whatever it was had stopped moving. Again, I called out. Honestly, I wasn't expecting much, considering how last time went. But a few moments later, a man stepped out of the woods and into the light. Though it startled me, because he came from a different area than what I was looking at. "Didn't mean to scare ya," he said with a smile as he casually walked up to the fire and sat next to it. He held his hands out to warm them by the fire. He acted as if he were supposed to be there, or like he knew me or something. Can I help you? I think you're at the wrong campsite," I said. "No." I didn't know which part he was saying no to, but either way, it was an unsettling response to not add anything to. I sort of had to think for a few seconds about what to do or say, so there was a very strange, tense little bit as we both sat by the fire, not speaking. It got so tense that I sort of just asked whatever came to mind, which in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have. "Do you happen to be the one I heard talking out in the trees around my other campsite earlier?" The man stayed looking at the fire, but his face visibly fell flat. "Must have been someone else," he said with a much colder, monotone voice. Something was extremely off about all this, but I still didn't know how to get out of it without risking causing trouble. Before I was able to think too much about it, a stick cracked behind me. I looked back. It was from the same spot to the back left of the campsite. My heart sank. The man wasn't alone. Someone else was here. I turned and looked back toward the campfire. He was staring at me. To be perfectly honest, I don't even remember whether he was smiling or angry or what, because all I remember was the intense, cold, and dead look in his eyes. I instantly sprung up from my chair and made a dead sprint into the trees. I heard one of the men say something, clearly talking to the other in frustration, and momentarily I heard footsteps running up behind me. However, as I got deeper into the woods and into the darkness, I lost them. Having grew up in these woods as my backyard, I was still able to somewhat navigate through them and to the road, following it back to my parents' house. They called 911 for me. Long story short, I led a team of officers to the campsite in the morning. Everything was gone. I don't know if that makes things better or worse. On one hand, it could have meant they were just there to rob me. But on the other hand, it made it definite that they had bad intentions, so they really could have been trying to do anything. After all, one of them did chase me for a minute. Shouldn't surprise anyone to say I never went back in those woods behind my parents' house. I was driving from northern Montana all the way up to Alaska. I'd converted my SUV into a camping rig and was spending 2 months traveling and camping out of it, and the main goal of those 2 months was to drive the Alaska Highway. This road was famous for a reason, though. It went through the western portion of Canada and was very desolate and rough. I knew that beforehand, so I came in as prepared as possible for the journey. Of everything to be nervous about, though, the one thing that had me feeling a bit more vulnerable was that because I had to drive through Canada, I couldn't bring any firearm with me. Usually, I always carried a piece tucked under my seat just as a means to protect myself in an emergency. But for this trip, I couldn't. Anyway, the first day went well. I got in a good 8 hours of driving. Most of this section of the road was a little less desolate than the next portion. This next part only had a gas station every couple hundred miles, so I had to stop and fill up every single time and be very careful about how I drove. By sundown, I was just about ready to pass out. I pulled off on the next campsite I saw. Out on the road, there were rest stops every once in a while, but there were also a ton of trails that just had empty, wooded camping lots. Those were the ones I always preferred. Since it was already late, though, I didn't see much of the lot I pulled into. It just looked like forest all around me, and nobody else was there. So I put up my window shades, hopped in the back seat, and slept until morning. Everything seemed fine. I got good sleep and didn't wake up at all during the night. Before hitting the road again, though, I wanted to stretch my legs and get a walk in. Right when I stepped outside, I noticed a trail, so I decided to follow it. It wasn't very long, though. I think I walked maybe 5 minutes before getting to another campsite, but something didn't feel right about it. It was scrappy and rugged. Clearly someone had been there recently, and it sort of looked like they left in a hurry. Half of their stuff was missing, and the other half was torn up and thrown across the site. After only being there for 30 seconds, I turned around and headed back. I didn't know if someone was still around, but I trusted my gut and walked back to my car. When I got back though, there was now a truck parked right up next to my car. It was an all-black pickup truck with tinted windows. Nobody was outside of it, so I assumed they were inside watching me as I got up to my car and got in. With the strange campsite and the sudden truck parked near me out in the middle of such an isolated road in the forest, I just left right away. I didn't even have to think about whether or not something was actually wrong, because getting out of there quickly was the obvious answer. I drove for 3 to 4 hours straight after leaving that campsite until I got to the next gas station. I pulled in. This gas station looked very old and only had one double-sided pump. Nobody else was there. I got out and started the pump. I have to say, the views were incredible out there, with mountains in every direction, so I didn't mind waiting a while for the slow gas pump to fill the car. However, after a few minutes, I saw a truck coming down the road. As it got closer, I was almost sure it was the same black truck I'd seen at the campsite. My stomach tightened when they pulled into the gas station and right up to the other side of the pump. Of course, it made sense they'd be getting gas, as you kinda had to at every stop on this road, but it still felt a little strange. Why would they have pulled into the campsite and only stayed there for a few minutes, just to leave right after I did? Thankfully, I was done in 30 seconds, getting back in and driving off. I think part of what made it all feel so off was that I never saw the guy. He never got out of the truck or showed himself, so it just made it all feel a little more unusual. Regardless, I felt good knowing now that my tank was full. I'd be driving non-stop for a while, likely putting a ton of distance between us and getting to just enjoy the scenery. Also, I'd hopefully be ahead enough to find a campsite during the day, so I wouldn't be parking anywhere blind like I did the previous night. I drove a long while, pretty much until I noticed the sun start coming down. Then I found a decent spot to pull off. It felt a little more hidden. The trail sort of nestled away in the brush, and there weren't any signs of anyone having been here recently, so it definitely wasn't a popular place to camp. I felt a lot more safe here than I did before. I really wanted to set up my tent and have a nice outdoor campsite, as it was way more spacious than sleeping all cramped up in the back of my car. But something in me told me not to, just in case. So I just made food outside and enjoyed the nature until sundown, then got back in my car. The next day was hopefully going to be shorter than the last two, and knowing that, I decided to stay up and watch some videos on my phone that I had downloaded. I was there, awake for probably 4 hours. I felt very comfortable there, and was actually really excited to be getting into Alaska tomorrow morning. But then, around 11 p.m., I heard something outside my car. Even from just a second of listening, I was 100% sure it was a person walking. The dry sticks and leaves made it very loud and distinct. I quickly put my phone down and sat up to look out the window, but I was beat to it. A man's face was pressed up against the side window, staring in at me. I could barely see him, but there was no mistaking that that was what I was seeing. I jolted back, losing my breath from the instant fear. They also moved back, disappearing into the void of darkness just past the window. I immediately jumped up to the front seat, seeing the second guy that I'd heard walking, running up to the car. He smashed open the back window just as I got to the front. My adrenaline flowing made it hard to do the simple task of getting my keys out and starting the car. That, on top of also looking back at what the men were doing. One of them was running up to my driver window, while the other was sticking their arm through the broken window to try opening the door from the inside. In the panic, I somehow managed to get the keys into the ignition and turn it on right as he opened the back door. I floored the car. As I pulled out, I passed by that same black truck parked off the path, sort of hidden in the bushes. They had followed me all this way. I drove a mile or so, then pulled off to close the back door that was still hanging open, and to call the police with what little cell service I had. Obviously, out in the middle of nowhere, it took forever, and the men were probably long gone. I never got their license plates, and it was too dark to get any facial features, so it was a lost cause. Despite the horrible experience, I still ended up making it to Alaska and enjoying the rest of my trip after repairing the window. What both of the men were intending to do, breaking into a car in the middle of the woods at night, knowing I was inside, is left to speculation. I prefer to not even think about it. It was the middle of summer, and being an avid backpacker and camper, I'd heard from one of my buddies about old fire lookouts that you could rent. Apparently, they were retired lookout stations, usually in the middle of nowhere, miles and miles into the forest. The one I chose was pretty much the most isolated one I could find. It was easier to rent, having available slots basically through the whole summer, and I liked hiking anyway. There was only a single picture I could find of it though, and it was super old and blurry. So really, I had no clue what to expect of the lookout tower. I knew it was built in the 1950s, so it'd be old, but as far as how much restoration was done to it, I was going in blind. I brought my usual backpacking gear and started the hike at 9 a.m. There wasn't much out there as far as views go, not for the first few hours. It was just very dense, harsh forest terrain. The trail wasn't even much of a trail anymore, just a very rough path. After 5 hours though, I finally got a glimpse of the lookout tower. It was far in the distance still, sitting atop a mountain. It looked very small and wasn't one that was high up on stilts. It looked more like a cabin than anything, maybe raised up 10 to 15 feet. There was another hour of trekking before I actually got there. The hike was definitely worth it just for the view alone. Felt like I could see the whole world from there. The fire lookout was in rough shape, however, very noticeably old, with some patchwork here and there done to certain parts. It had a wraparound staircase of 20 or so steps leading up to the walkway that went around the whole lookout, and the inside was entirely empty. It wasn't glamorous, but honestly, it could have been worse, and to have this view, I'd take it any day. With a few hours of sunlight left, I tossed my bag down, made some food, and relaxed on the outer ledge. It was real quiet up there, just the sound of birds and wind. I was pretty beat from the hike up, so after the sun fell past the horizon, I threw my sleeping stuff on the wooden floorboards and laid down. It was only around 8, so even though I was exhausted, I couldn't quite fall asleep as fast as I wanted. I think 30 to 40 minutes went by. Then I thought I heard something outside the lookout tower. Before I could even get up and look, there were clear footsteps coming up the stairs. I hurried out of my sleeping bag and up to the door, which notably had no locks on it. A few seconds later, a man came around the corner. He was older, say late 40s, and had longish blonde hair. Somehow, he wasn't startled when he saw me, almost like he knew I was already up here.
Great place to stay a few nights, isn't it?
He said, grinning and walking up closer to me. I agreed, still a little nervous, and mentioned I booked it for the next 3 nights. I was already a little put off though, because I knew there was nothing else around here. So him being here while I was also here was really strange. I asked if he was camping around here.
Actually, I was hoping to be staying here tonight.
He said, again with a grin. I wasn't sure how to respond to that, but I ended up just saying sorry.
Well, it looks like you've got enough room in there. I mean, it's just you here, right?
After hesitating for a second, I lied, saying a friend of mine was just a few minutes out, and that unfortunately we couldn't let him stay here with us. He looked at me, grin fading from his face, and didn't say anything for a moment, then nodded and started to leave. It wasn't until he turned around to head back down the stairs that I noticed he didn't have a backpack. No gear at all. Surely he had to have left his pack somewhere nearby. Couldn't see why anyone would be this far isolated without any camping gear, even if they were planning on using the fire lookout as a shelter. I got some uneasy feelings about that man, so I stayed up a bit longer and just stared at the forest below the lookouts. I did end up getting really sleepy though, and got back in my sleeping bag and passed out. I woke up in the morning, feeling better and spending the first hour making coffee and enjoying the view. When I headed down from the lookout though, there was a note attached to the wooden railing at the bottom. It was just a piece of paper with the word sorry written on it, with the smiley face next to it. I assumed it had to be from the guy, but if he put this here, then he must have come back sometime in the middle of the night while I was sleeping. I immediately felt really unsettled just thinking about it. The fact he even left a note was just weird. Despite the strange occurrence, I decided to go for a walk. Maybe it was to also scan the area for any signs of the man still being around, because clearly he didn't leave when he should have. I wandered around the forest, down the hill from the fire lookout. There wasn't much to see though. It was all the same dense forest that I'd hiked up through the previous day, and I didn't notice any campsites or things left behind. I went back to the lookout and enjoyed the peace and quiet for the rest of the day. I stayed up much later than I did the night before. I had this small battery-powered lantern that I hung up on the wall so I could see a little better, and I just sort of existed. I thought about whatever and stared out at the darkness beyond the lookout, only slightly being able to make out the outline of the mountains. I want to say I didn't start getting ready for bed until nearly midnight. Could have even been 1 a.m. I set up my stuff, then grabbed my lantern and headed down the steps to the forest to take a leak real quick before bed. I walked up just to the edge of the tree line, but as I got there, I saw something move in front of me. Just a glimpse of something shift out of the dim light from my lantern. I froze for a second, then held it up further forward, although it didn't help much.
Someone there.
The silence that followed my voice made things even more eerie. I basically ran back to the lookout. It didn't feel much safer in there, though. Windows covered every inch of the walls, and like I mentioned before, the door didn't even have a lock on it. Part of me really wanted to leave, but heading out now while it was pitch black out, and with the trail being nearly non-existent, would probably be worse than just staying put. I kept the lantern hung up on the wall and looked out the windows at the forest below. It was really eerie knowing that with the light, if someone was out there, they could probably clearly see me in the window. Meanwhile, all I saw was darkness. I could see the bottom of the stairs though, so that's what I was focusing on, making sure nobody tried to come up. The longer I stayed there watching, the more this sense of unease started to fill my body. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I decided to pack up my stuff. At least then I could make a run for it if I had to. As I stuffed my backpack, I would stop every 30 seconds and go back up to the window to look out at the stairs, then continue packing, repeating this over and over until I finally got everything in my bag and ready to go. I set it up against the wall, then went back to the window. There was a man at the bottom of the stairs. He was standing right at the first step, staring at it, like he was just waiting there. I could only see part of him through all the railings, but I was sure it was the same man from yesterday. He had no backpack on and looked about the same height. I was beyond terrified. Why was he back? And why was he just standing there motionless at the bottom of the steps? What if he decided to come up again? Everything was making my mind race. I must have been at the window watching him for 2 whole minutes before the man finally moved. He took a couple steps back, pausing for a moment, then walked off. The way he went, though, was blocked off for me by the walkway, so I lost sight of him. And if he did keep walking in that direction toward the forest, it was too dark for me to tell. In the moment, I felt sure the man was stalking me, or at least keeping watch of me, and creeping up too close for comfort, especially in the middle of the night. It could have just been my gut telling me something, but I felt like if I stayed any longer, something really bad would happen. I waited a few minutes, then I grabbed my bag and quietly walked down the steps and to the surface below the lookout tower. I can't even describe how unnerved I was walking away from the tower and into the dark forest, knowing there was a chance the guy was still watching me, and possibly following me into the trees. For that very reason, I kept my pocket knife open and in my hand the entire time. I walked for about 15 minutes, which was when the trail started to get a lot less defined, so I was forced to pull out my lantern. I hoped I was far enough that the man didn't follow and wouldn't be able to see the lights. The next 5 hours were exhaustingly unsettling. By then, the sun had come up though, and I was able to finish the hike and leave the forest. I think it's hard to fully put into perspective how horrifying those nights were. Something in me knew there was something bad about that man and his intentions. One thing I keep thinking back on is that I had told the man I booked the tower for 3 nights, which leaves no reason for him to have come back multiple times to check if I was there. It also means he likely thought I'd be there for the 3rd night. So had I not left early and actually stayed for the 3rd night, things might have taken a much more disturbing turn. This was last fall, in the first week or 2 of October. I'm not entirely sure how to start this, because it honestly all happened completely out of the blue. It was a normal Monday afternoon. I'd gotten out of work and pulled up to my home just after sunset, and usually I'll park in the garage and head inside from there. But as I pulled in, I noticed something hanging on the front door. So instead, I parked in the driveway and went up there to see what it was. Taped right on the door handle was an envelope. I knew right away it wasn't some random soliciting ad mail because it had my name handwritten with a pen on the front. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was short, but what it said I found pretty disturbing. Essentially, the person mentioned they've been interested in me and wanted to meet at a specific place and time the following day. Oddly, that was one of my days off of work, but I figured it was just a coincidence. The writer of the letter didn't sign it though, so I had no idea who it was. Obviously, there was no way I was going to go anywhere and meet with some random person. I headed inside, tore up the letter, and tossed it in the trash. I thought the whole thing was pretty disturbing because they knew my name and my address and said they were interested in me, which is just a strange thing to say, given I had no idea who they even were. Anyway, I thought tearing up the letter would help me not to stress about it too much, as there wasn't anything I could do about it. At least, not yet. After all, it could have just been some stupid prank. I went on with my night and got in bed just before 11. Like I mentioned before, I was off the following day, so I slept in and spent pretty much the entire day inside. Can't even remember what I did all day, but I know I made dinner late, like 8 or 9, and started getting ready for bed right after. I went upstairs and into the bedroom to take a long, relaxing shower. However, a little ways into it, I heard the doorbell ring. Confused who could have been outside my home at this time of night, I opened the shower curtain and listened for a minute. But with nothing else, I figured they left. I wouldn't have answered the door anyway. I closed the curtain and continued with my shower. As I stood in the water and tried to relax though, I started connecting the dots between the letter from yesterday and the odd doorbell ring. I knew it could have been me completely overthinking it, but also the feeling that I wasn't felt a lot stronger with every minute passing. And then I heard something. It sounded like a few light thuds, or maybe creaks, somewhere right outside the shower curtain. I froze and listened, then quickly shut off the shower and moved the curtain aside. Nothing was there. My heart was still racing as I got out, dried off, and got dressed. First thing I knew I had to do was check the front door. I crept downstairs and looked out the peephole, but saw no one standing outside. So I opened the door. Immediately, a paper slip fell from the crease in the door. Before reaching down and grabbing it, I looked around outside. The trees rustling in the wind and the crickets chirping were the only sounds, and as far as I could tell, the whole neighborhood was still, dark, and quiet. Eerily so. I picked up the paper and closed the door, then unfolded it. It was a note in the same handwriting as the one from yesterday. As I read it, I could feel my blood rush and my face getting pale. The writer was clearly angry about me missing the meetup earlier today. It was like they really thought I was supposed to show up. And at the end of the letter, they signed their initials this time. DN. This was incredibly creepy and disturbing, as it was way more than just a small note. This felt way more personal and unsettling, and much less like just some small prank. I genuinely didn't know what to do, because he was already gone, and I still didn't know who it was. Even with their initials, I had no idea. I paced around the living room for a while, a good 30 minutes at least. Even then, as I paced around in my own home, I kept getting this uneasy feeling that I was being watched. I'd look and check out the windows and the door over and over, but never saw anything. Eventually, I knew I'd have to sleep. Overall, though, I decided that in the morning I would go to the police station and bring in the letter and see what they had to say about it. I started heading upstairs. As I reached the top, I suddenly heard those thumping or creaking sounds, the same ones I'd heard while in the shower, coming from inside the bedroom. I hurried into the room. Nothing. Not a single thing in there to warrant the sounds I'd been hearing. I'll admit, they weren't concerning sounds at all. It was just with everything else going on that it made me feel like everything could be something, even though it likely was nothing at all. I closed and locked my bedroom door just in case, then checked the closet and every other spot in the room to make me feel better. And just before getting in bed, I remembered one other place. I never went out there, but there was a small balcony attached to this master bedroom. I was a private person and always kept the blinds closed, so I often forgot it was even there. I walked over and pushed aside the first few blinds so I could get to the door handle. I didn't even have to grab it to see that it was already unlocked. There was no way I left it like this. However, I didn't get a chance to open the door because just a second later, a figure moved from the corner of the outside balcony. I jolted my eyes at him, seeing he was staring at me as he moved closer to the other side of the door. I turned and sprinted out of the bedroom. I heard the balcony door open as I was leaving. I ran for the closest neighbor I knew would help me. The man didn't seem to be able to find where I ran off to. Police were at my house and searching around within 10 minutes. I was still incredibly nervous because I knew how awful it'd be if the man got away. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. They never found him. Me and a couple officers started going over the time frame of everything taking place, and it's pretty apparent that the man broke in while I was in the shower. Likely, the sounds I'd heard while in there were from him opening and closing the balcony door, where he went to hide. So since I'd heard those same sounds again, he must have at some point gone back inside the house while I was pacing around thinking about the letter, which makes that whole feeling of me being watched even more disturbing. And most of all, what I find really unsettling is that from the short glimpse I got from the man looking at me, I felt like he looked oddly familiar. Not like someone I knew, but maybe just someone I'd seen in passing at some point before. It kills me that I can't figure out where or when I'd seen him. It really could have been anything, like just passing him at a grocery store, which makes it way more disturbing that that was enough to get this man to follow and stalk me and form this dangerous fixation on me. A whole lot more could have happened that night, and all I can be is thankful that I got away mostly unharmed. It's been almost a year, and so far nothing else has come up. No notes, no weird sounds, nothing. I hope it's done. But even now, I'm still constantly looking over my shoulder, unsure who's watching. I was driving from LA all the way back to the East Coast. I had taken the road trip to see a bunch of friends for a wedding, and ended up staying for over a week. Because I stayed a little bit longer, I only had 4 days to get back home before my next shift at work, so I was really pushing it with how long I was driving. It was 1 a.m., and my eyes were killing me. It felt like my eyelids weighed 100 pounds. The only caffeine I had was a hot coffee from a gas station 3 hours back, so not very hot anymore, and I was in the middle of nowhere. It felt like a dead highway, nothing on either side of it, and barely any cars or trucks around. Just the occasional car speeding past me, only to disappear down the road 30 seconds later. As I tried to keep my eyes open, I noticed again headlights coming up behind me. They weren't very bright, so it must have been a pretty old car, without those crazy bright LEDs everyone has nowadays. The car was also going a lot slower than most that passed by. This one took forever to catch up to me. After tailing behind for a minute, it merged into the other lane and started to pass. I kept my eyes on the road, just making sure I stayed in my lane to let them through. But after a while of them not actually passing, I looked to my left to see what they were doing. The car was matching my speed right beside me. Some old, dusty, dark red car, and their window was down. From what I could see, there was just one man in the car, driving, obviously, but he was also staring at me. I had my window up still, so I don't know if he actually could see me, with it being dark and with the reflections and all, but he was looking at my window as if he could. The man didn't try to hide it either. His light was on inside his car, so I could see him clear as day. He looked red-eyed and kind of drunk, just from his expressions and movements. But he remained at the same speed and just stared at me. It really freaked me out. I tried slowing down, but he slowed down too. I slowed down even more, and again he matched my speed. So then I slowed down an absurd amount, like down to 25 miles per hour on the highway. And finally, he didn't copy me and just held his pace and kept driving. He disappeared down the road a minute later. I didn't know what the hell to think of that. Maybe he was a creep, maybe drunk, or honestly maybe both. Only a couple minutes after whatever that was happened, I was back to struggling to stay awake. I knew I needed some caffeine, and possibly even some rest for a minute. 15 minutes down the road, I pulled off the highway and into a really small rest stop. It looked like just some bathrooms and a coffee machine. No other cars were there. I parked and got out, walking up to the machine and getting a coffee, hoping it'd be enough. By the time I got it and headed back to my car, another car was pulling in. I instantly saw it was the same old red car from the highway earlier. How the hell was he pulling up behind me again? I never passed him, at least not knowingly, and there was nowhere else to pull off. He would have had to pull into the grass off the highway pretty far out and discreetly wait for me to pass. Otherwise, I'd have seen his car on the side of the road. I got in and looked in my mirrors for a second. He didn't pull in behind me though. He went right up next to me, like he did on the highway. I could just feel his eyes staring at me, too much to ignore. I looked over, and sure enough, that's what he was doing, staring right at me with those red, unsettling eyes. What did this dude want from me? I turned my car on, but the guy started talking. He was yelling something, trying to get my attention through the window. I looked over again, and he reached over and opened his passenger door, motioning for me to get in, with this disturbingly friendly expression on his face. I started to pull away, glancing over one more time and seeing the instant shift into a dead stare. I got back onto the highway, but the guy followed. He kept trying to do the same thing where he'd merge into the other lane and match my speed, but this time I wasn't having it. I was getting a little more aggressive, trying to keep him away from me, but he matched my energy, also getting more aggressive. I could have sworn he even tried to pit maneuver me several times, but I braked just quick enough before he could hit my car. Eventually, I saw one of those emergency vehicle U-turn spots, a pass-through to get onto the other side of the highway that went in the opposite direction. In a rather dangerous and illegal split-second decision, I turned onto it before he could even react and follow me. As I safely got onto the other side of the highway and sped in the other direction, I looked in my mirrors. I felt my heart continue racing for a moment. For a second, his brake lights turned on, But it seemed he gave up, as a moment later, his lights faded out and continued the other way. I was shaking for the next little bit, finding a gas station and just taking a break for an hour to cool off and to keep distance between me and that guy. During that time, I put in a tip for the police, mainly saying I thought he was just a drunk driver driving dangerously, but it didn't come up to much of anything. That was until 4 days later, well after I'd made it back home. Having time to actually breathe, I looked up if the cops ever caught any drunk drivers on that road recently, thinking I might find the dude's mugshot or something. But what I found made this whole thing more disturbing than I ever could have imagined. A day before I left LA, there had been a disappearance of someone on that very road. They found their car in the grass, and the person was just gone. No traces. The only clue they had was from a different driver on the road, who mentioned they saw a rusty red car driving erratically around the car that was later found abandoned in the grass. Reading the whole case almost felt like deja vu. It was exactly like what I experienced that night, only I made it out safely. Had things gone any other way, that night could have taken a really disturbing turn, and I likely would have disappeared too. This past winter, I stayed in a cabin in the northeast part of Washington state for a week. It was a winter cabin, meant for staying in during the cold season and enjoying the winter scenery out in the mountains, which usually wasn't possible in regular 3-season cabins. When I got there, it hadn't snowed yet, but by the time I woke up after my first night, snow had began coming down. It was a lot, too, enough to keep me cozied up inside for the whole day. The fireplace with the cabin look and feel made for a great, relaxing time. I got real tired around 9 p.m. and decided to get to bed, but I had to run out to my car real quick to grab a bag I forgot to bring in yesterday. I put my shoes and jacket on, then opened the door to run outside, when I immediately saw that the snow on the porch was messed with, like something had been there. When I got further out, the spots in the snow became more clearly footprints. I could even see the print that their boots left behind. I then looked to see where they came from, but lost sight of them, going out toward the woods. There was no saying how long ago this was, but I'd never heard them on the porch. Whoever it was didn't knock or anything. I got what I needed from the car, then headed back in. Since they didn't knock, and I didn't get a text from the cabin rental place, I figured it wasn't anything important. I got in bed and fell asleep. For the next 2 days I was at the cabin, there wasn't all that much to mention. I did the same, pretty much being inside by the fireplace all day. But through those 2 days, several more times, I checked outside and saw fresh footprints in the snow. Always the same ones, coming up to the porch and going back in the same direction. So, on the 3rd day, I decided to go in that direction and see what was out there. I put on a heavy jacket and walked into the woods. The footprints were long covered up by then, by the snowfall from last night. So I was just walking in the general direction I'd remembered seeing them going. I only made it a little ways into the trees before realizing everything looked the same. Like it was all just a blanket of snow over everything, in every direction. And with the downfall already starting to cover up my tracks, I knew I risked getting lost if I went any deeper. From being out there though, I saw nothing of interest that anyone could have been out there for. No paths or roads or trails. I went back to the cabin and warmed up. Strangely, after that, no footprints showed up on the porch for the rest of that day. It was like whoever it was knew I was looking for them, and so they kept away. That's what I was hoping for, anyway. Hours later, the sun fell past the trees, and the woods and cabin were quiet. The soft breeze of the snowfall outside was the only noise aside from the crackling fireplace. I hadn't thought about the strange footprints in a while. I stayed up relatively late, not getting in bed until 12 a.m. I fell asleep quickly with the winter ambiance outside. I felt like I was knocked out for a while, definitely a couple cycles of sleep before I woke up, so it was probably about 3 a.m. The sound of wind and snow outside were still coming through the cabin walls, but there was another sound. A crunch every couple of seconds. Someone stepping in the snow very, very slowly. Honestly, I don't know if I would have known it was footsteps, let alone woken up, if I didn't already know about the footprints being outside the cabin. That's how slow they were walking. I sat up in bed. For some reason, I was pretty calm. Nervous for sure, but not scared really. I was confident I could hold my own if something were to happen. I know it was very arrogant of me, maybe dangerously so. I listened until the sound stopped. It seemed to go somewhere on the other end of the cabin, the back wall maybe, where the fireplace was. So after a few minutes of not hearing anything else, I got up and left the bedroom, looking down the main hallway. It was really dark. There were no lights built into this hallway, so when I looked down, I saw nothing. In that moment, though, a very strong, uncontrollable feeling took over the false confidence that I had just a few moments ago. Suddenly, I was really nervous that something was wrong, more than just someone walking around outside. I took a few steps into the hallway. Still, I heard nothing. I moved all the way to the end, where the living room/kitchen was, and just when I took a step toward the front door, I heard a loud thump on the floor behind me. I spun around and looked down the hallway I just came from. I only caught a quick sight of someone moving quickly through the shadows, rushing down the hallway toward me. I ran straight for the front door, grabbing the keys I'd left right by it, and running out barefoot through the snow to my car. I got in and couldn't see anything at all, as the entire windshield was covered in a thick layer of snow. I didn't know if he was chasing me, or right in front of the car, which made the whole thing even more horrifying. Thankfully, I could see out of my back windshield, being upright and small, so I began backing out, going as fast as I could down the gravel driveway. I did end up making it out of there. Took over an hour for a cop to show up, and by then, the footprints of him leaving the cabin were covered, so it wasn't even clear where he went. From what we could find though, the man got in through a window on the far wall near the fireplace. Putting what happened together, most likely he then quietly crept to the farthest bedroom down the hall to look for me. It was the only other one aside from the one I was staying in. Had he chosen correctly, I would have been face to face with him and had nowhere to run. But instead, I left my room at the perfect timing, giving me a chance to escape. It's insane and honestly terrifying how just a couple of seconds made all the difference. For a good few months in late 2021, I was staying at my grandparents' old house. They had passed away a while ago, and my family hadn't sold the place yet. It was kind of used as a vacation house for the time being, but for those few months, I was in between apartments and needed somewhere to stay, so it worked out. I wasn't too happy about it, because it was a really old and janky place. Not having to pay rent was nice though. Anyway, this happened 2 months into my time there. I had gotten home from work at 6, parking in the driveway and heading to the mailbox to collect my mail, when one of the neighbors came up to me. She was an elderly woman I'd talked to a few times before, just about my grandparents and my situation and whatnot. Through our few conversations, I also happened to mention that I was staying at the house alone temporarily, and that's why she came up to talk to me. She remembered me saying a couple days ago that it was just me staying there, but earlier in the day, while she was walking around the neighborhood, she saw someone moving around behind the windows inside the house. When she also noticed my car wasn't there, it made her worry because she was pretty sure I was at work. I thanked her for letting me know, but honestly, I didn't fully take in what she said. She didn't seem super confident in what she saw, and I mean, that would be crazy. Why would anyone be inside my grandparents' old house? Still, walking inside, I did a quick check around for any signs someone might have broken in or moved anything, but I saw nothing, not even a shoe print on the ground. It definitely was a weird and unsettling way to start my night, but I hoped it really was nothing to be worried about. I made dinner and watched TV in the living room for the rest of the night. It was a Friday, so I was off the next 2 days. I must have stayed up past 1 a.m. During that time, I'd basically forgotten about the whole thing my neighbor had told me. It kinda just felt like a regular night. With it being very late though, I shut off the TV and headed upstairs. Now, when I'd gotten home earlier, the sun was still lighting up most of the house, so I didn't turn most of the lights on, which made the whole house very dark now that it was in the middle of the night. The only lights I turned on were the ones in the bedroom when I changed out of my work clothes. I headed up the creaky wooden stairs to the second floor, then down the hallway and into the bedroom. This was a really old room, just like the rest of the house, but it had 2 sections. There was the bed area with, well, a bed, and then there was a small hallway with a closet and one of those dated vanity desks built into the wall. On the other side of that was a large bathroom with a separate shower, bathtub, and way too many mirrors. Kinda creeped me out, to be honest. Anyway, I used the bathroom, shutting off the lights in there as I went back into the bed area, turning off those lights as well. However, right away, I realized something was off. There was still a light on. I turned around, and after a second, I felt my heart start racing a little bit. That vanity/closet hallway between the bed and the bathroom had a light on. To give context on why this was so disturbing, it was one of those single, old-fashioned light bulbs attached to the ceiling, with a thin string hanging down that you had to pull to turn it on and off. For that reason, I never once used that light. Not to mention, it was nearly impossible to accidentally turn it on or off, because it was only managed by pulling the string. I walked up to the hallway and stared at it. The fuzzy, bluish hue of the light was barely coming through the fogged-up glass on the bulb. Thing had to be decades old. I carefully reached up and pulled the string. The amount of force it took to actually get it to click off was deceptive. Definitely wouldn't just click on its own. The more I looked into it, the more nervous I got, especially when my neighbor's comment about seeing someone inside here crept back into mind. Looking back, I should have left right then and there, just to be safe. But I think it's a lot easier than people give credit for to let yourself believe it's all some kind of fluke. Like, what if the light really did just turn on its own? It was old as hell. Maybe it wasn't working right. And again, the chances someone broke into this old place of all things was so extraordinarily small that I really felt I needed real proof if I were to believe it, let alone call 911 over it. I mean, a single light being on in the house that I never ever used was creepy and unsettling. Don't get me wrong. But at the same time, I didn't feel it was enough to really freak out over. Though I definitely wasn't going to get good sleep anytime soon. I turned the lights in my bedroom back on, but stayed in there with the door closed, figuring I'd sit in bed on my phone until I got tired again. Over the next 30 minutes, I kept catching myself looking at the door and at the hallway to the bathroom, like out of paranoia. Even after all the excuses I made, my gut still felt like something was off about all this. I just didn't know what to do about it. I'd already checked the whole house earlier, but I figured maybe I should double check. I got up and opened the door to the main upstairs hallway. The house was eerily quiet. I took a few steps through the hallway to the spare bedroom and opened the door. It still had my grandparents' old bed and furniture in it, along with a bunch of boxes stacked along the wall. I got a really unsettling feeling being in that room. I know the whole point was to actually search the house, but as soon as I stepped foot in there, my body just locked up. My heart rate was picking up, getting faster and faster, like an alarm was going off inside me, telling me to get the hell out of that room. And then I saw something. A shape sticking out under the covers on top of the bed. As I looked at it more, I slowly was able to make out that it was a body. Someone was in the bed under the covers. The immediate panic set in as I tried to back up, but it caused me to stumble a bit, making a loud creak on the wooden floors. Instantly, the person sat up in the bed, so fast that he surely wasn't sleeping and was probably listening to my every move already. It was a man, his eyes piercing into mine, but that was all I could see before booking it out of the room. His footsteps followed close behind. I didn't stop until I got out of the house and ran down the road to the neighbor's doorstep, the same one that I talked to earlier. She let me in and got help on the way. I was thankful that officers arrived relatively quick, but the intruder must have run out right away, because he was already gone. In the weeks that followed, my parents helped to do an inventory check on everything they knew was in the house, or at least all the valuables, and nothing was missing, or if anything was, it wasn't valuable. Which begs the question, why was he there? A lot of people think he just knew that nobody lived in the house, and so he was squatting in it, living in it without anyone knowing. But what terrifies me, and makes me think that might not be the case, is that I'd been there for 2 months, so he had to know I was there. Was there a chance he'd been hiding, living there with me that whole time without me being aware? And what would have happened had I not found him and run away? I moved out immediately and haven't been back to the house since. I probably never will. I was on my way back from a road trip. Wasn't anything great, just visiting some of my folks for a few days. I always hated that the drive was 14 hours though. It was just too much to do comfortably in one day, but also not long enough to feel justified in getting a hotel and making the drive twice as long. I always forced myself to do it all in one day, which just took all the enjoyment of the road trip completely out of it. Anyway, I'd left my folks' place around 3-ish in the afternoon, so I was driving through the night. Wasn't a smart move. I was tired and sleepy by 12 a.m., but this part of the road wasn't through cities, or anything at all like that. It was barren forest roads, or just open nothingness. Couple gas stations every so often, and maybe a few dirt streets leading to who knows where. I figured I'd stop whenever I had the chance and grab something to keep me awake. A coffee, energy drink, literally anything. I found a small gas station a little ways down the road, in the trees off the side of the highway. Looked like a local one, so maybe a small town was behind it, though it was of course covered up by all the trees. No streetlights even went down that road that went behind the gas station. As I pulled in, I noticed this gas station looked a little strange. It wasn't like those modern ones, with the giant overhang covering the pumps. It was just a few pumps sitting out in the open, and no lights near them. Even the building didn't look like it had lights on inside. All this to say, I definitely would have thought this place was closed, or maybe even abandoned, if not for the 3 or 4 other cars parked in the parking lot. It genuinely looked like a typical old-school gas station on the side of a barren highway, with other customers also here, except not as lit up as it should have been. But I assumed since others were here, it was still open. I parked next to the other cars and got out. As I walked up to the door, all I could see was my reflection on the glass, until I opened it. The instant I opened the door, all 4 or 5 people standing scattered throughout the inside of the shop immediately turned and looked at me. Not just a glance. They all shifted and stared simultaneously, holding their eyes fixed on me. The men's faces were all rugged and emotionless, but that's all I could see, because after being caught off guard by them, I noticed not only was it insanely dark, but it was also empty in there. All the shelves were still standing, but nothing was on them. Even after seeing that, and looking back up at all the men, they were still looking at me, like I didn't belong there. All of this took place over maybe 10 seconds, before I backed up and let the door close in front of me, then hurried back to my car. I didn't know what the hell that was, but it felt like some strange cult meeting at an abandoned gas station that I unknowingly barged in on. I pulled away from the store and back onto the road. Guess this was kind of one of those things you just don't think too hard about and move on from, because 10 minutes later, I had accepted the fact I'd never actually know what I walked in on, and was back to looking for a gas station. Hopefully an open, safe one this time. The empty road didn't look promising though. Another 10 minutes went by, when headlights came up behind me. I was going relatively fast, maybe 10 or 15 over the speed limit, and with no other cars out on the road, this was the first time someone had come up behind me in probably hours. And then there was another, maybe even several more. I couldn't really tell, as all their lights blended together. They were all coming up real fast though. I moved into the right lane to let them pass, and the first one did, but quickly merged back in front of me. I was aware enough to already be slowing down a bit, but I definitely wasn't expecting them to slam on their brakes. Nearly had a heart attack as I did the same, trying to also swerve to avoid hitting them. I managed to stop just a couple feet from their bumper, with my car slightly sideways. And that's when everything sort of set in. This was one of the cars from the gas station. I looked in the mirror. The other car stopped right behind me, and another came and pulled up near the door. In a matter of seconds, multiple men were getting out of the cars and surrounding mine. If this were happening during the day, and not on some desolate road at 1 a.m. with nobody else around, I might have taken a safer approach. But given the circumstances, I felt I had no choice but to take the risk of trying to escape. With cars blocking every way, I drove off the road and into the trees, not getting too far before grabbing my phone and bailing from the car. I sprinted into the forest. It was essentially pitch black, even just 30 feet into the trees. I kept running, hearing all the men's footsteps coming up behind me. But as I got deeper, I think they couldn't see enough to follow me. I sat up against a tree and waited, maybe a whole hour even, without turning my phone on. I was scared one of them would be around and see the screen, so I sat there and just stared at the nothingness of the pitch-black woods and listened to the leaves rustling in the branches above me. After that hour, I finally got my phone out and used the map to get me back to the road, where I could then get a signal enough to text 911. All the cars were gone, except for mine, still between all the trees off the road. After that long night, a tow truck was able to get my car out, and surprisingly, it had almost no damage. Whoever had been following me and attempted to stop me, there's been no update on. I think I've settled on the fact that the men likely thought I'd witnessed or seen something in that gas station that I shouldn't have, and so they followed me in an attempt to clear themselves, whether that was by kidnapping me or getting rid of me and hiding any evidence in the secluded forest off the side of the road. The picture of me walking into that gas station and all the men turning and staring at me is still burned into my mind. It still haunts me thinking about what could have happened. I'm writing this while the memory is still fresh. It only happened a couple days ago. I had Tuesday and Wednesday off of work this week and was hanging out at home. No plans, just chilling and having some quiet time alone. On Tuesday night, I thought it'd be nice to order some food, just to save me time from cooking. So I pulled up DoorDash and found some random place that was still open, and got a small meal. It said it'd take around 45 minutes. I stayed in the living room and watched YouTube on the TV. It was a good night up until this point. After around 45 minutes, I happened to get up and just casually look out the window. I don't even know why, really, as I could easily just open the app to check on the delivery. But when I looked out, I noticed there was a car parked in my driveway. Immediately, I opened up DoorDash and checked the map, and the delivery guy was still 10 minutes away. But then, who was in my driveway? I'm not really a loud-spoken type person, so I wasn't keen on going outside and saying anything to them. I mean, surely they'd realize they were in the wrong place and leave without me having to say so. I went back to the sofa, but got up and checked out the window every couple of minutes. When the DoorDash order arrived, the car was still there in the driveway. From the window, I couldn't really see much into the car, so when I answered the door for the delivery, I asked the driver if they'd seen anyone in there. He said yeah, there was just some guy in the driver's seat, but he didn't really look too hard. I thanked him and he left. I felt really uncomfortable about this. I tried to gather the courage to go out there and see what they were doing, but only 5 minutes after sitting down to eat, there was a knock at the door. I jumped up from the couch. My heart was racing, and I stood looking at the door for a minute before walking over slowly, trying to stay quiet. When I looked out, no one was there. The car was still out there, though. I took a deep breath and opened the door. I stepped outside. It was dark and quiet. I looked down the side of the porch, but still saw no one, so I walked down the driveway and up to the car. When I looked through the window, whoever had been in there was gone. A chill came over my body. I moved to the back of the car to get the license plate, only to find it didn't have one. That made me even more scared, because it made me think whoever this guy was, he had planned for this. I moved away from the car to head back inside, as I was really starting to get uncomfortable, and felt now that it was definitely a good time to call the police. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, but immediately I got a really strange feeling. The house was quiet, but it was like my senses picked up on something being off. I crept over to the living room and looked at the couch. My phone was gone. Every bone in my body felt like it just stung with fear. Before I could even get myself to move, I heard the slow sound of a door hinge creaking open. Then a few footsteps moved quietly down the hallway toward the front door, but they stopped just before passing the corner. They were waiting there, right around the corner near the front door. I couldn't just run out. I was frozen for a few moments, then started to very carefully and quietly make my way to the other side of the house. No matter which way I chose, I'd have to pass by the hallway that I knew the man was in, so whatever I was gonna do, I knew I had to do it fast. I hesitated for a second. I think the anxiety of what I was about to do took over for a moment. But then I got a hold of myself and made a dead sprint for the back door. I unlocked it and ran out of the house. And just as I stepped out the door, I heard the man behind me call out my name. Not even just my first name, but my last name too. It confused and shocked me enough to make me turn around and look back. The man was barreling toward the back door, and I could see most of his face, but had no recognition of ever seeing him before. I turned back and continued running. The area behind my house was just a flat continuation of the neighborhood, not really any places to hide. I could hear the man still chasing me though. I kept running, making it past the next row of houses, and decided to just start running down the sidewalk and hope a car or someone comes by to help me. But after a few minutes, I looked back, and the guy wasn't there. It took a long time to find someone willing to help me to call the police, and so the man wasn't anywhere around by then, having taken his car and fled. And apparently, the guy was smarter than I thought, because I immediately tried tracking my phone, but he tossed my phone in my front yard before leaving, so we couldn't track it to find him. If this were just a regular break-in or robbery or whatever, I'd be a lot less traumatized. But clearly it wasn't that. There was more to it. This was a stalker, having known my full name and likely a whole lot more about me. There's no saying how long he'd been watching me for, or what he wanted to do. It's only been a few days though, and I'm already planning to move far away. I can't sit around knowing whoever that was still knows where I live. If there's any updates in the next few weeks, I'll try to let you know. I had booked an Airbnb in spring of 2022. It was a small getaway cabin in a forest with several other identical cabins spread throughout the owner's land. There were some very faint trails or paths leading between all the cabins, but none of them were marked, likely only there from when the owner was building them and moving through the forest constantly. I had nothing exactly planned for this trip. It was only 3 hours from my home, and I just thought it'd be nice to spend some time away and hang out in the woods. I slept in on my second day, waking up at noon, making some coffee, and relaxing inside by the fireplace. Just before sunset, I threw on a hoodie and went out on a walk. I wasn't sure exactly where I was going. I was just following a thin path in the forest that was behind the cabin. I assumed it would take me to one of the other cabins though, and hopefully loop back around. At some point on this trail, once I was a bit deeper in the woods, I noticed some people standing out in the forest, maybe 200 or 300 yards out. Pretty far, but the way they were standing was odd. It was two men standing motionless and looking down at something on the ground. It didn't look like they were talking or really doing anything. except looking at something on the forest floor. It was weird enough for me to sort of watch them as I kept moving along the trail, eventually getting too far to see them anymore. Had to be just two guys from the other cabins wandering the forest, and from my distance, it might have looked stranger than it was. At least, that's what I hoped. I kept walking for another few minutes, but I started to notice this trail wasn't really looping or curving at all. It was just going straight into the woods, nowhere near where the other cabins were. I think having seen those guys out there a few minutes ago, adding on with the trail seeming to not be what I thought it was, I felt like maybe I should just head back. Almost right when I started to think about it though, there was a sudden sound that caught me completely off guard. It came from behind me and sounded like some strange scream, or maybe animal call, kind of like an elk bellowing, but something about it felt unnatural. I turned around, but immediately froze. The two men were on the trail behind me, still really far, maybe 150 yards down, and they weren't moving. They were facing me though, maybe even staring at me. I couldn't tell from that distance. Honestly, whatever that sound was that I heard felt like it was too loud and unnatural for it to have been from them, even if it was them trying to mimic an animal sound or something. The sound I heard echoed through the whole forest and was nothing like anything I'd heard before. But why were the men here, following behind me? After standing there looking at them for about 10 or 15 seconds, I started taking a few steps back, and that's when they suddenly walked off the trail and into the trees. They continued until they were out of sight. I didn't really move for a few minutes, because I'd have to go down to where they were to get back to the cabin, so I wanted to make sure they were really gone. I definitely didn't want to go further down the trail either. After 5 minutes, and being pretty certain that they were away from the area, I hurried back down the path and got to the cabin. I thought about messaging the Airbnb host and asking if they knew anything about that path, or the two men, but I figured that might sound sort of strange and unnecessary. I kept it to myself, throwing some wood into the fireplace and taking a breather. The sun was mostly set by then, so the rest of the night I didn't plan on leaving the cabin. Not that I would have anyway, after what I saw out there. I made some tea and sat by the fireplace. After just a half hour, I felt much more comfortable and was able to actually start relaxing. However, I only got a short 15 minutes before I heard that sound again. The same one that I heard out in the woods. It was a bellowing scream that sounded like it was still pretty far out there, but I didn't know how much sound these cabin walls blocked out, so I couldn't say for sure how close it was. I got up and looked out the back window. I genuinely couldn't see anything except for the faint outlines of trees. It was way too dark out there. But the longer I stood there, the more unnerved I felt. A chill ran through my body as I pulled the curtains back over the window. I started looking up on my phone what that noise might have been. Maybe it was an animal sound that was common around here, and I just didn't know about it. I was never really a nature guy, so I wasn't knowledgeable enough to know. After a bit of research, I didn't find anything. The more I kept looking into it, the more creeped out I started to get. So I put my phone down and tried to not think about it. Another 30 minutes passed. I can't say that I did a good job at forgetting it, but through the crackling fireplace, I heard a few sudden footsteps on the doorstep at the front of the cabin. Boots thumping on the wood. They stopped right outside the door. My heart was pounding. A long 20 seconds passed before there was a slow knock at the door. I couldn't tell you how terrified I was as I crept up to the door and looked out the peephole. Standing right outside the door were two men. I assume the same ones I'd seen out in the woods. They had masks on, those cheap plastic animal masks that only cover the front of your face. They had hoods over their heads and looked nearly identical to each other. I immediately began dialing 911 and backing away from the door. I heard them knock again as I got through to the police. I tried to talk quietly, but I was pretty sure that they could still hear me. I only got halfway through explaining my situation when a sudden hard thud hit the door. For a moment, I thought they were about to break in, and I felt the most intense fear I'd never even come close to experiencing before. But after that thud, I heard their footsteps leave the doorstep. I managed to get back up to the door and look out, seeing both of them walking back into the woods. It took nearly 30 minutes before a cop arrived. He found a mark on the outside of the door, like the men had stabbed a knife into it before leaving. The cop took note of everything, but it was hard to tell if he believed me or not. I knew it sounded crazy though. I got out of there afterward, and obviously never went back to those same cabins. Every couple of months, I'll look up news in that area, expecting some strange disappearances to happen in those woods, but so far I haven't found anything. What the men wanted remains unknown to this day. Just last year, I'd gotten a promotion at my job. It wasn't too much extra pay, but part of the new position would have me traveling a ton to different locations all over the states. I was single and really had nothing else going on at the time, so I was really excited to travel. As for where I'd stay, it was always pretty random. Sometimes hotels, sometimes resorts, and every once in a while a small Airbnb. I'm not sure why they switched it up every time, but I thought it was interesting at the very least. Anyway, this week I was heading to a new town to visit their department of the company, and I was booked for an Airbnb nearby. I'd already had the promotion for 8 months at this point, and had gotten fairly used to it, so the excitement of seeing where my next stay was at had kinda died out. Once the plane landed, I got my rental car and started heading to the address of the Airbnb. I noticed right off the bat, though, it was farther than usual from where the company building was. Usually, if it was an Airbnb, it would be because it was very close to where the site was. But I think this time, the drive took 40 minutes. And when I arrived at just about 1 a.m., I thought there was a mistake. The place was huge. I mean, at least 4,000 or 5,000 square feet, with a huge yard and everything. I had to triple check this was the right place, and it was. I got everything inside, and I have to say, although the outside looked really nice, it definitely didn't look quite as good on the inside. Maybe just a bit old-fashioned for my taste. Still, I couldn't complain. There was a ton of space, way more than I could ever use. After the long flight, I was too tired to explore the entire place right away. I just brought up all my stuff to the bedroom, turned off the lights, and got in bed. As I laid there, I noticed how creaky the house was. It felt like it was making a lot of noise. Nothing concerning, but just these creaks and thumps in the walls. I thought it must have been just how bigger houses were. I mean, I wouldn't be one to know. I don't think I'd ever been in a house this big. But unfortunately, I'm a pretty light sleeper, so the constant noises kept me up long enough to realize I needed some water. I hadn't even eaten or drank anything since the flight. Sort of frustrated that I had to get up, knowing it'd only make it harder to sleep, I tiredly got out of bed and headed through the long hallway and down the steps to the kitchen. Strangely, once I was downstairs, all the creaks and thumps I'd been hearing for the last hour were gone. Like at some point between me getting up and moving from the bedroom to the downstairs hallway, all the sounds stopped. It was one of those moments that had me scratching my head, like what were the chances of that? Anyway, I grabbed a glass of water, not even bothering to turn on any of the lights, and headed back upstairs. I was able to fall asleep after that, as the rest of that night I didn't hear any more sounds or noises. In the morning, I only spent maybe 30 minutes there, waking up late and still tired, but having to rush out of the house to get to work. After being at the office all day, I went out with a couple guys from work to get drinks, so I actually didn't get back to the Airbnb until sometime past 11 p.m. I headed inside and sat on the sofa, relaxing for a minute. I was exhausted, but I remembered I still hadn't yet checked out the rest of the house. It felt almost mandatory to at least give it a look around, so I got up and just casually walked through the rooms. Walking through it, I honestly couldn't think of much use for an Airbnb this large. I even got so curious that I looked it up to see how much it was, finding it was actually priced the same as other much smaller places in the area, which I found to be a little odd. Also, it looked like some parts of the house weren't reset from the last guest. It looked clean, but some pillows were all over the couch, and some of the chairs and stuff were just in random places. It kinda looked like someone had just been here. And the most strange thing was that one of the kitchen chairs was pulled out. I was in there for a minute earlier that morning and never sat down, and I could have sworn all the chairs were pushed under the table before. Must have just overlooked it, I thought. I pushed it back under the table. After the quick 5-minute tour of the house, I figured it best to take a shower and head to bed for the night, as I had another long day tomorrow. I turned off all the lights, went upstairs, showered, and got in bed. I was just on the verge of falling asleep when a familiar sound suddenly came from below me. It was those creaks. They suddenly started again. The fact that I was just about to fall asleep made it 100 times more obnoxious. I sat up and listened, and even though I was annoyed, a part of me felt like it didn't sound like your typical house noises, so it made me a little uneasy as well. I started to think I could make out individual footsteps walking around under me, and maybe even cabinets being opened and closed. I couldn't tell if it was just my mind making up things, though. I got up and quietly opened the door. The sounds didn't stop this time. I could clearly hear them from the hallway. I carefully walked down and up to the stairs, which were wooden and kind of creaky, and as soon as I took a step, everything went quiet. My heart started racing. I moved to the bottom of the steps and looked down the hall. I could tell a light in the kitchen was on. I swore I turned off all the lights before going to bed, but there was still a small chance I just forgot about that light. I quietly walked down the hall and looked in the kitchen. My eyes widened. That chair in the kitchen was pulled out again, like someone had just been sitting there. Only a second after seeing that, I saw something else behind the chair. In the far back room, where all the lights were off and it was nearly pitch dark, a figure was peering around the corner, watching me. We held eye contact for a moment as I completely froze up before they jolted back behind the corner. A few seconds later, I heard a door slam shut. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but I ran up to that corner and flicked on the lights, searching around for a second to see where he went or if he was gone. But I didn't see him. I didn't even see what door he possibly could have gone through that I'd so clearly heard him slam shut. I ran upstairs, got my phone, and sprinted out of the house. I drove away and called the police. As far as what was going on in there, I'm afraid that I got very few answers. The host and the police talked for a while, but the host felt like he wasn't taking me seriously, or like he thought I was lying. Maybe he just didn't want to be responsible. But in all fairness, I had no proof of anything. I wasn't even able to see what the guy looked like. And the host claimed that there were no doors where I'd supposedly heard the man run and slam a door from. Everything just felt really weird about the whole situation after the fact. My company was nice enough to just move me to a hotel for the rest of the week, but honestly, I was pretty shook for the rest of that trip. Had I stayed in that house any longer with whoever was in there with me, I'm afraid that things could have gone a lot differently. I was seeing a few relatives during a trip I was taking across the country. They lived in a city I was passing through, about halfway along my drive, so I thought it'd be nice to see them and spend some time there. I booked an Airbnb in their town. It was just a typical small home in the suburbs, nothing too fancy or cool, just a place to stay at for a couple of days. I got there really late. I think it had to be 10 or 11 p.m. There was an email from the owner, Jay, that I got earlier with a passcode and everything to get in. While I was getting some stuff out of my car in the driveway though, I was partly alarmed by a man walking right up behind me. It was Jay, the host. I'd maybe been in the driveway for less than a minute, and I wasn't expecting him, or really anyone to be out here this late. He started casually talking to me and offering to help carry some things up to the door, and also showed me into the house. I was tired, too much to be confrontational, but I did feel weird he was even here. Usually, I never even met or talked to the other hosts of Airbnbs. I was sure he was just trying to be nice though. Maybe I was one of his first renters. He gave me a quick tour, even showing me up to the bedroom before saying goodnight and walking back downstairs. I started unpacking a bit, but really was waiting for the guy to leave so I can rest for the night. I thought if I went down there while he was still around, then he might strike up another conversation, which I was not in the mood for. After a minute, I never really heard any signs of him leaving, like a door opening or closing behind him, so I went downstairs real quick and just made sure he was gone. Didn't see him anywhere, so I locked up the door, grabbed what was left, and went back to the bedroom. It was late, so of course I just unpacked and went to sleep. In the morning, I saw my relatives, but only spent a few hours with them, so I was back at the Airbnb around noon and stayed inside just watching TV until dinner time. I went out to pick up something quick for dinner, but when I pulled into the driveway and headed up to the front door, I noticed it was unlocked. That was really weird because I don't think I'd ever forgotten something like that, especially not while staying in a foreign town at a rental property. My mind instantly thought back to the owner, Jay, and how sort of invasive he was when I first met him the night before. This seemed like much more of an overstep though, so I hoped it wasn't him, and was actually me just forgetting to lock it. I opened the door and stepped in.
Hello? Anyone in here?
I called out just to be safe. There wasn't a response, and all the lights were still off, so I closed the door behind me and went on with my night. I tossed the food on the table in the living room, turning on the TV and preparing to spend the rest of the night there, when something got my attention. It was a noise in the other side of the house. It sounded like something hitting the wall. I turned my head and looked down the hallway toward the sound, but I knew I wouldn't see anything. Now, even recounting for what happened that night, I find it odd that for some reason I was very fixated on that single, somewhat unprovoking sound in the house. I felt like I had to know what it was, or like it was something I should be cautious about, even after just hearing it once. I got up from the couch and walked into the room on the far side of the home, which I think was the family room, or maybe just a reading nook. Not sure what it was exactly. but it was a very small room in the back of the house with a sofa and a nightstand. But just a sofa and nightstand. No windows, no decorations, no TV. It was very plain and empty, which made it feel kind of off-putting. I flicked on the light and just sort of looked at the room, getting that off feeling about it, before noticing something else. Behind the couch, coming just up above the top, there was a crease in the wall. I looked a bit closer, eventually moving the whole couch over to the side. It was a door, not a regular sized one, but like a small, maybe 3-foot hatch door. I mean, had I not heard anything and been looking around so intently, I never would have noticed it, especially not behind the couch. I felt uneasy as I reluctantly tried to open it, but it was locked. There wasn't a lock on the outside though, so it had to be locked from the inside, which made no sense at all. Something in me felt like there was something really disturbing behind that door, and I would not be able to stay here and feel safe unless I knew what it was. I couldn't just break down the door though. I pulled out my phone and called the number on the Airbnb, Jay's number. My thought was that if he acted weird about telling me what's back there, or if he tried to come over, or if I just got a bad vibe, then I'd leave right away. I walked up to the front window and looked outside as I called Jay's number. It was dark, but I wanted to be prepared if he just suddenly showed up at the house, like he did on the first night. The phone rang through, so I dialed again. I tried over and over for a few minutes, eventually giving up. Honestly, I didn't know what to do. It was hard to know if I was overthinking this, or if this was something where I should actually just trust my gut and pack up and leave. I walked back down to the small room and stared at the door for a minute. As I stood there thinking, I just pressed on the door again, not really trying to do anything. But this time, it creaked open. It wasn't locked anymore. I nervously stuck my head through the gap in the wall. The only light was what bled through the doorway from the room, but I could see a dark staircase going down into some sort of unfinished basement with old, sketchy wooden steps. I couldn't even see the bottom. It was too dark. However, I could see the lock on the back of the door. It was one of those bolt locks that you slide back and forth, meaning it was manual. Someone had to have just been behind this door and physically unlocked it. My face went pale. I backed away from the wall. I was so horrified, I couldn't even think for a moment. Was someone inside the house with me? It felt like my whole body was shaking as I started to creep down the hallway. Most of my stuff was still upstairs in the bedroom. It wasn't much, just 2 suitcases. I could probably have them packed and get out of there in 3 minutes. Not my best move, but that's what I decided to do. I got upstairs and started throwing everything into the suitcases. The paranoia of someone possibly being in the house with me had me glancing at the doorway to the room constantly, afraid someone might appear there any second. I was just able to stuff the last suitcase when I heard a creak from the hall outside the room. When I got up and looked out though, nobody was there. It was really hard to hold myself together, but I knew I had to get out immediately. I picked up both suitcases and started hurrying toward the stairs, half expecting one of the doors in the hall to swing open suddenly. But I got down to the front door, running out, and with both hands full, I didn't even bother closing it. But not 3 seconds after I left, before I even reached the car, the front door slammed shut behind me. That only confirmed my worst fear. I got in my car and got the hell away from that place. Later, once I got to a hotel, I tried calling Jay again, as well as texting him. He never answered or responded. Personally, I think Jay had a hidden basement below the house that he was staying in, possibly used to spy on me, or maybe even worse. What's really strange is how after I found the doorway, Jay completely cut me off and stopped responding. He probably snuck out while I was trying to call him, but what he was going to do after knowing I'd found the room, I really have no idea. I guess it depended on what he was hiding down there. Honestly, I think if I had gone down there and figured out what was going on, I don't think Jay would have ever let me leave that house.
I used to work a dead-end job at a gas station, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. I didn't really have a life outside that either. I was just watching TikToks all night, every night, for years. I just didn't care enough to do anything but get by. Some nights, in the long stretches of time between customers entering the store, I think to myself, man, just let anything happen. Anything to alleviate the boredom. I fantasized about some hot older woman coming in and kidnapping me, or a bunch of bikers recruiting me into their gang. None of that good stuff ever happened, but I eventually got my wish. It was the deadest part of the night. A pickup truck rolled into the station, did a loop to face outward toward the street, then parked by a pump and shut off. I watched as a hooded man stepped out of the driver's side and started pumping gas. I didn't get a good look at his face, but I wasn't worried. I was just glad he didn't come inside to pay. One less human interaction to get through, right? A couple minutes later, I looked outside again as the man was putting away the nozzle, then got back in the truck. I expected him to drive off, but he just turned the thing on and sat there, idle. After a short while, his brake lights started flashing on and off. His foot was on the pedal, off the pedal, on, off, a few seconds at a time. I wondered what the hell he was doing in there. Eventually, a man threw open the door on the passenger side and stepped out. I quickly looked away, not wanting to get caught staring. I hadn't even realized there was another person in there until then. I figured they must have been talking, maybe arguing, until the driver made the other guy go in and get something. Soon after, the passenger entered the store, and I immediately noticed he wasn't just also wearing a hood, but a hockey mask as well. I greeted him a little nervously. Of course, he said nothing to me and just walked by. I said to myself, dude, it's nowhere near Halloween. This guy looks like a tool. Deep down, though, I was a little worried. A masked man coming into the store at night and all. But for the moment, it seemed fine. I tried keeping track of him, but then my eye was caught by some movement outside. The driver of the pickup had gotten out of the vehicle again, this time with the lights and presumably the engine still on. He was rummaging around in the bed, leaning over the side with the tailgate up, so I couldn't see what he was grabbing. When I glanced away from him, hoping to see the masked man in the same spot he was in a few seconds ago, I realized I lost track of his location. Suddenly it clicked. These guys had to be up to no good. My options were few. I calmly walked around the counter to the front door and locked it. Better to fight one guy than two, right? And absolutely not the guy who was definitely grabbing a weapon from his truck. As soon as the lock hatched, they both must have heard it. The man outside slipped something into his pocket, then started storming up to the store. A moment later, I heard a voice behind me ask, "Why'd you lock the door?" I turned around and saw the man in the hockey mask standing just a few feet away. He was also holding something in his jacket pocket, surely a weapon of some kind, so he wasn't unarmed like I had hoped. Like a cold wave, the realization of how screwed I was hit me. I was sandwiched between a guy with a knife and a door, and right on the other side of the door was another guy with a knife, or whatever weapons they were about to use against me. As the guy outside started pounding on the flimsy glass, I knew it wasn't going to hold him back for long. The masked man was slowly stepping closer to me, telling me to unlock it, but I was frozen, trying to find something in my useless brain to help me. I knew it wasn't going to hold him back for long. I was sure everything was about to explode in my face, when out of nowhere, bright lights glared through the window. I didn't know who or what it was at first, until I heard the familiar sound of the local deputy's patrol car parking right in front of the store. I breathed a silent sigh of relief and turned to look at him as he stepped out. He was the average lazy small-town cop, aloof, pudgy, but armed, and backed by the entire sheriff's office. Finally, I followed the commands of the man in the mask and unlocked the door. Not for him, but for the deputy. The cop waltzed in, totally oblivious to the tension in the room. He cut right through it, walking over to coffee, pouring himself a cup, then to the pastry case to pick out a donut. Careful not to get too close to Mr. Hockey Mask, I went back behind the counter just as the cop was coming up to order. I rang him up, but also started making small talk with him to keep him in the store. I didn't want to outright tell him what was happening and risk a shootout. Less than a minute later, the man in the hockey mask left the store. His friend outside shot me a look straight out of one of my nightmares. The first time I even saw his face. He was pissed, but there was nothing he could do but leave. Once it was just me and the cop in the store. I told him what was going on. He said he'd stick around for a few hours in case they came back, and thankfully showed up when he did. Because I know whatever would have happened to me otherwise would have gotten nasty. Ever since then, I was terrified they would come back. It got to be too much, and I eventually quit because of it. In all reality, my life is on a better track than it was when I worked the night shift. So maybe those guys giving me the scare of my life was just what I needed. When I first started out as a police officer, I got stuck with the graveyard shift. All the rookies in my department have to do it for at least a year. The unnatural sleep schedule alone is exhausting, not to mention the fact that the craziest, weirdest stuff happens in the middle of the night. One minute you're bored out of your mind. The next, you're stopping a crackhead from burning down a homeless encampment with a gallon of gasoline. However, the kind of things that really stick with me aren't always so flashy. There's one night I think about all the time, and it happened in my first week on the night shift. Back then, I was working with a partner who was showing me the ropes. We were on patrol, rolling through the empty streets with no one in sight. Around 3 a.m., we passed by a restaurant and noticed there was a dim light on inside. We both agreed the place had been completely unlit the last time we saw it that same night, so we decided to check it out. Strangely, the front door was unlocked, but other than that, nothing seemed out of place. We opened the door and shouted inside, "Hello? Anyone in here?" Our voices echoed through the empty building with no response. Something didn't feel right. The light wasn't in the dining area, but coming from the back of the restaurant, yet I could have sworn the source was visible through the window just a minute earlier. It was like it had moved. I entered the building, followed by my partner. He ordered me to go check out the back while he stayed in the front in case anyone came running, but I was already making my way to the kitchen. There were no windows in there, no street lights pouring in, just me and that warm but dim light I was chasing. It seemed to have moved again, now coming from behind a door that was slightly open. Once again, I announced my presence. "Police, come on out." Nothing, not a sound. I approached the door and opened it. I was met with a set of stairs down to the basement, but still no light source. I shouted back to my partner that I was going down to the sublevel, and by the time I looked back, the light was gone, swallowed by the basement. Unholstering my flashlight, I shined it down the steps. It was never as bright as I wanted it to be, but it was just enough to see as I made my way down. At the bottom, I discovered the switches didn't turn anything on. As for the initial light, I saw it when I looked up. It was coming through a ceiling vent. Immediately, my mind went to fire. I even reached for my radio and was about to call the fire department, but then I hesitated. I didn't see or smell any smoke, and the light had only gotten dimmer, not grown brighter like fire. Confused, I walked directly underneath the vent and shined my light at it. Yet again, there was nothing to see. My flashlight outshone whatever was casting the other light, and when I turned my flashlight away, the original glow I was after finally just disappeared. At this point, I was really scratching my head, trying to figure out what the hell I was seeing. Eventually, I decided it was nothing and started going up the stairs. But then, at the third or fourth step, I stopped. I heard something, like rats in the walls. It was a hollow, echoey scratching. I turned around, and as the sound continued, it was coming from the same vent I was just looking at. Something was crawling around in it. I stood there for about 20 seconds, listening, until it stopped. Quietly, I made my way down the steps and underneath the vent once more. I looked up without my flashlight to see if the glow would return. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear something else. A raspy, shaky breathing. As my heart began to race, I pointed my flashlight at the vent again, this time putting it right up to the grate. The light shined through the slits and inside the vent, falling on a sight I'll never forget. A human face. It stared right at me, a look of insanity in its eyes, before shifting away and disappearing. The crawling sounds came back, louder than ever, like they were bearing down on me. After a moment of shock, I headed toward the stairs to get back to my partner. But when I looked up to the door, I saw a dark figure standing in my way. They were tall enough to fill the doorway, but the second I shined my light to get a better look, they slammed the door shut. I unholstered my gun and ran up the stairs. I tried to get through, only for the damn door to be locked. I banged on the door non-stop, calling out to my partner. Moments later, it opened, and he was on the other side, looking utterly confused. It stared right at me, a look of insanity in its eyes, before shifting away and disappearing. The crawling sounds came back, louder than ever, like they were bearing down on me. I asked him if he'd seen anyone going his way, but he said no. We'd been alone the entire time as far as he knew. I was left completely dumbfounded. I told him everything that happened and he helped me search the rest of the place. But in the end, he refused to call for backup. He told me it was best if I didn't earn a reputation for spooking myself, which I understood meant he didn't believe me. And if anyone else in the department heard about it, they'd laugh at me. Just a rookie seeing things in the graveyard shift. That night, I chose to accept it and tried to move on. But I've never forgotten. I just don't understand. There was no way for anyone to leave the building except by going past my partner out the front door. So where did that person go? How did they even get in the vent? There was no sign of breaking and entering anywhere either, so I don't have a clue as to what they wanted. What freaks me out the most is that face I saw looking back at me, and the sight of the person who locked me in the basement. I'm just glad I got out of that situation without confrontation. Who knows what could have happened? A few years back, I was doing food deliveries after work to scrape up some extra cash. Since it was late at night, not a whole lot was open. Only a few local places were holding it down. One pizza joint, a Thai place, and an Indian restaurant. All serving fresh hot food to the night owls. I'd make deliveries for these places for about 2 or 3 hours, then call it quits. One night, I picked up an order from the Indian place. It was chicken biryani, probably the most popular item on their menu. The address was farther away than usual, out in a part of town I couldn't remember ever delivering to. I didn't know if it was because people didn't really live there, or if it was supposed to be out of range, but I drove there anyway. The closer I got, the more unsure I became that I was even going to the right place. The street seemed completely deserted. All the houses looked abandoned, and I barely saw any cars parked in the driveways. Even the street lights didn't work. Everything was so still and dead. But then, for just a moment, I saw someone in the window of one of the houses. I turned my head to get a better look, only for them to disappear into the shadows behind them. The house itself was just as old and run down as all the rest, with no lights on inside. But knowing there was someone in there made it feel different. Of course, it also had to be the house I was supposed to deliver to, and it got weirder. Despite their initial instructions to personally hand the order to them, the customer messaged me on the app saying, "Hey, I had to leave, but the door is open. Just put it on the table. I left an extra tip for you there." Immediately, a bunch of questions ran through my head. First of all, why order delivery just to leave before it gets there? But more importantly, Why lie? They had to know I saw them in there, though I started trying to rationalize it. Maybe that was their kid or something, who was told not to answer the door. Yet if that were the case, telling me to go in there and be alone with them, even just for a few seconds, made it feel even stranger. After debating it for a bit, I finally decided to just get it over with. I wanted the extra money, and I didn't want to waste any more time. I got out of my car and took the bag up to the door, which was unlocked like they said it was. I slowly pushed the door open just a crack. It was pitch black inside, but all the way on the other end of what was a rather small house, I could see moonlight. The back door was wide open. At first, I didn't know what to make of it, but I figured they must have left in a hurry and forgot to make sure it closed behind them. With both doors open, a giraffe ran through the corridor and out past me. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight, not wanting to bother fumbling for a light switch. Stepping inside, the floorboards creaked and popped underneath me like they hadn't been walked on in years. I soon found a table, the only one near the front door, so I assumed it was the one they meant for me to put the food on. They didn't leave any tip there like they promised, though. I was disappointed, but it was okay. I set the food down. But then, instead of leaving right away, I thought I'd do them a common courtesy and close the back door. Otherwise, it would let out all the warm air and their house would be cold when they got home. I walked over and shut it. Then I turned around back toward the front door. When the light from my phone hit it, I saw something that made me freeze. There was a figure, a person standing in the way. The light was too dim to make out any major details, but they were tall, looking right at me and blocking the front door. I slowly reached for the door handle behind me, quietly turned it, then I bolted out the back door. I sprinted around the house and got back to my car as fast as I could, then sped off without looking back. Once I was out of the area, I finally looked down at my phone for directions, but instead, I saw a text from the person who placed the order. It said, "You're lucky you're fast." I didn't respond. What was the point of talking to them anyway? I knew the person I saw in the house must have been them, but that was about it. I didn't know what they wanted, except that it was far from good, and I couldn't even be sure that they were the actual owners of that house. It was probably vacant for all I know. After all that, I had some trouble settling down, so I figured I'd make a few more deliveries before going home. But I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about it. I hate to think about what would have happened if I hadn't gone to the back door, and instead returned directly to the front, where that creep was lurking. That, and if the back door had somehow locked or jammed once I closed it, if I still would have been able to escape. Recently, things have not been going well for me. Last year, my wife and I lost our 5-year-old son very suddenly. We didn't know how to handle it. I buried myself at work, staying out of the house for as long as possible, not even having the strength to talk to my wife. Everything reminds me that he's gone. A few months ago, my wife left to stay with her mother for a while, maybe forever. I can't blame her, but now it's just me in the house, completely alone. Most nights, I stay at work until my boss literally orders me to go home. I always dread walking through the door, where there used to be the sounds of my wife coaxing her son to bed. There's only dust. That was until a few weeks ago, when I got home close to midnight. I heard it before I even stepped inside. The home security system was blaring. The alarm had been tripped, as if someone had broken in. Carefully, I made my way to the door, but it was still locked. I used my key to get inside, still not seeing signs of anyone, then punched in the code to turn off the wailing siren. Silence fell immediately. I listened out for sounds of anyone, anything, yet there was nothing. The house was completely still. Suddenly, my phone rang. My heart jumped, but I soon realized it was just the security company calling to see if they should send the police. I told them I'd handle it myself. Hanging up, I combed through the house, checking every corner, behind every door, and even the attic. I made sure there was no one home but me. That night, I was exhausted enough to shrug it off as a false alarm. Then I fell asleep. I didn't forget about it though. It stayed at the back of my mind. And then, a few nights later, something else happened in the middle of the night. This time, I was awoken by a familiar sound, a thumping against the wall. On the other side of the wall was my son's old playroom. And the sound was just like when he would throw his toys at the wall during playtime. My blood ran cold, but no, it couldn't be that. Instead, my mind raced to the next conclusion. Someone was in there, messing with the stuff. I shot out of bed in a fit of rage. Nobody had been in the room in months. It was supposed to be left untouched, not ransacked by thieves. I stormed down the hall and threw the door open. I stood there confused. Nobody was in the room, but all his things had been thrown across the floor. His dresser empty, his toys broken, even his pictures torn. At this point, I was useless. With the thought of some burglar breaking into the house just to destroy the memory of my son, I could do nothing but call the police. The findings of their investigation that night were strange, to say the least. The bedroom window was still intact and locked. The alarm was never tripped, and there seemed to be no sign of theft or forced entry. However, they promised to keep a lookout for any suspicious persons in the area. I thanked them and they went on their way, leaving me alone to pick up the pieces of my son's room. All I could wish was for that to be the last of it, but the ordeal was not over. A few nights later, that same week, I was in bed, struggling to sleep. The minutes dragged on, until it was past 4 in the morning, and I still couldn't keep my eyes shut. Something was wrong, and I was going to get to the bottom of it. Then, in the dead of night, I heard a sound, clinking in the kitchen. For just a second, a pile of dishes got moved and resettled. I quietly got out of bed, then made my way to the kitchen. I stood in the center, scanning the countertop, until I looked at the strainer in the sink. The knife I had washed and left there to dry earlier in the evening was gone. Feeling naked and vulnerable, I began to panic. I looked around for whoever could have taken it. Then I saw someone standing in the dining room. They were just a kid, a boy, far too grown to be my son. But other than that, they could have been anyone. And they were standing in my house with a knife. In a split second, I decided to fight. I screamed and charged the kid. They immediately turned tail and ran for the back door. As they fumbled to get it open, they dropped the knife to the floor. They got 1 foot outside, but I was just about to grab them, only for the door to slam shut right as I got there. I smashed into it face first, sending blood gushing out of my nose. I took a moment to collect myself. Then I picked up the knife off the ground and ripped the door open. I ran through the yard, chasing after the intruder. But then I found myself in the middle of the street, and they were nowhere in sight. They had disappeared, and in their place was a pair of blinding headlights that began flashing red and blue as they came to a stop in front of me. It was a cop, on the same patrol through the neighborhood I had made them start doing in the first place. There I was, almost naked in the middle of the street, at an ungodly hour. A knife in my hand and blood running down my face and neck. I must have looked insane. I'm sure the only reason I didn't get arrested was because the cop recognized me. He ushered me inside and took my statement. But instead of promising to go after the little bastard who broke into my house and busted my nose, he told me to get some rest and book an appointment with a therapist. In other words, he thinks I'm crazy. And now the whole neighborhood thinks so too. I'm no freak though. Someone is terrorizing me, tormenting me with the loss of my son. Maybe they even had something to do with his death. When I find out the truth, I'll leave an update. On nights when I can't sleep, I get in my car and start driving for Uber. It's a perfectly mindless, monotonous thing to do for a while until I get tired enough to go home and crawl into bed. One night, I accepted a ride to pick up a guy from his house, or at least what I thought was his house, and take him to McDonald's. Weirdly, he didn't say a word the entire ride, not even a cursory hello. He was wearing a baggy pullover with the hood up, covering most of his face. When we arrived at McDonald's, he got out silently, then walked off. The whole interaction, or lack thereof really, felt a bit odd, but I shrugged it off and found a spot in the parking lot to wait for my next ride. Just a few minutes later, my phone buzzed, letting me know one was available. As luck would have it, it was the very same guy I had just dropped off, though that isn't uncommon when there aren't many drivers available. At such a late time of night, I had to think he had just met with a dealer and picked up something illegal. Despite that, I accepted the ride again as I didn't really care, and the money was the same. I pulled back around to the front door of the building, but then, there was nobody there. When I stopped and looked at my phone, I realized he had literally just canceled the ride. I was a bit annoyed, a little confused, but also suddenly tired and hungry. So, I decided to hit the drive-thru and get some food, then head home. To cap off my night, I decided not to eat at home though, and instead go to a nearby park. It's connected to a couple trails that lead into a nice wilderness area surrounding a small lake. I love going there every once in a while, in the middle of the night, when it's just me, and the water is perfectly still. I drove over, backed my car into a spot, then got out and started walking down the trail to the lake, which only took a few minutes to reach. I sat down at a picnic table and began eating my food. The night was quiet, just the bugs, the wind, and the admittedly disturbing sounds of food wrappers and eating thanks to me. However, just a few bites in, another man-made sound cut through the trees. An engine, part of a vehicle bigger and heavier than my car, was pulling into the same parking lot just a few hundred feet away. The engine cut off, followed by the lights. Then several doors opened and closed. Then it was just footsteps, several pairs of them, approaching at a brisk pace. Before I knew it, 3 men emerged from the trail, and in the middle was the exact same man I had just dropped off at McDonald's not half an hour earlier. My heart started to race. I knew I had been followed, but still, I was trying to come up with other reasons for them being there. Maybe he'd met up with some friends when I dropped him off and they were coming to smoke. Awkwardly, I stopped eating and stared at them. They came up to the table and surrounded the corner opposite to where I was sitting. And they didn't say anything amongst themselves or to me for a moment. I finally just stood up and started repacking my food, saying I'd let them have the table since it was the only one there. That's when the man I drove said something, at last looking at me. His face was heavily tattooed, and his piercing eyes betrayed the tone of his voice as he told me it was fine, that I could sit down with them. I didn't sit, because they didn't sit either. Then, he pulled something out of his pocket, a flask. He held it out to me, his arm stretched over the table, offering me a drink. I asked what was in it, but he didn't answer. They all just stared at me, like they were waiting for me to put my arm out. At that moment, I looked over my shoulder for just a split second. I'd heard something, another set of footsteps, emerging from a different trail nearby, directly behind me. I didn't give any time trying to figure out what they looked like, or whether or not they were with these other men. I just ran. I dropped my food, ducked to the side, and ran. Immediately, all 4 of them started chasing after me. They kept shouting, "Stop, stop," but I didn't listen. Hell no, I wasn't stopping. I sprinted for my life. I don't know how I gained as much ground on them as I did. It must have been my sheer panic, but I made it to my car well before they reached the parking lot. I got in and locked the doors. Then, right before I slammed the gas pedal, I realized I was looking at the back of the van they rode in on. I floored them, swerving out of the spot and spraying mud in their faces right before they got to my car. Then I drove like a madman. I didn't stop speeding until I got back to my apartment complex, where I waited with the lights off for at least 20 minutes to make sure they hadn't followed me there before I went inside. I had lost them, if only by the skin of my teeth. It's been a few weeks since then, and I haven't stopped thinking about this. I have to think the whole Uber ride to McDonald's and the canceled return trip were all a setup to some sort of trap, but I don't know for what. Were they trying to rob me? Kidnap me? Lord knows I'll never get a chance to ask them. I'm just glad I didn't decide to go straight home with my food. Otherwise, I would have led them straight to my apartment. One thing is for sure, driving Uber at night is no longer an option for me, as I never want anything like this to happen again. If all my friends hadn't been there to see it, nobody would have believed this ever happened. The night was supposed to be good fun without parents or teachers watching over us. My mom and my sister were going on a trip together over the weekend, something about her sweet 16. But I didn't give a shit. All I cared about was the fact that I had the house to myself. So on the very first night they were gone, I invited all the guys to sleep over at my place. No rules, no limits. It was my house, so I didn't have to do anything but set up my Xbox in the living room. One guy brought snacks and pizza. Someone else scored a case of beer. And our most degenerate friend stole a nug of his dad's weed. We were all still lightweights back then, so that was more than enough. We housed down all the food while trying to beat Halo 3 on Legendary. But before long, we were too crossfaded to progress, so we just started killing each other in Forge mode. It was a blast, literally one of my favorite memories from being a kid. However, that same night also holds one of my most terrifying memories, not just in my childhood, but of my entire life. It started around 2 a.m., and being in the suburbs, that meant we were the only house full of people who were still awake for miles. I think it was just me and the degenerate still playing Halo, as the other two guys were just laying around talking about random shit. In the middle of that quiet, chill moment, we suddenly heard a door slam. It came from upstairs, but it was so loud it made all four of us jump and look that direction. The two guys who were just about to pass out immediately started tweaking, saying my mom had secretly been hiding in the house and was about to kill us for using drugs. Of course I didn't buy it, and neither did my degenerate friend. Nobody else was in the house but us. My heart was racing though, and by the look on his face, I could tell his was too. I knew the random sounds my house made at night. Sometimes the AC could pull a door closed, but never that fast, never that loud. My friend and I went to check it out, telling the other guys to stop being pussies as we went upstairs. There were only 3 doors up there: my bedroom, my sister's bedroom, and our shared bathroom. My bedroom and the bathroom were open, but my sister's door was closed. It had been that way since she left. I never wanted to go in there, but something was telling me it had been open and then slammed shut again. After taking a quick peek into the other rooms to make sure they were clear, we went to her door and slowly pushed it open. When we flicked the lights on, I didn't notice anything at first. I was looking for a person, maybe even an animal, something that might move and attack us. But what I saw then was different. All over my sister's desk and vanity mirror, there was blood. Fresh, bright red blood, looking almost like it was still dripping. Not knowing what to make of it, I tried calling my sister to see if she had left it like that for some reason. She didn't pick it up though. Neither did my mom when I tried to call her. They must have been asleep, since it was the middle of the night, but that left us with no explanation. We went back downstairs, leaving the hallway light on for peace of mind. The other guys went pale and wide-eyed when we told them what we saw. They started throwing out crazy ideas like demons and ghosts, but I figured they were just being dumb because they were high. I was trying to convince them, and myself, that there had to have been some kind of makeup or hairspray explosion, not a slamming door at all. I was confident nothing else would happen, and I nearly got everyone to chill out. But then, in the middle of our debate, something else happened. Without warning, the upstairs hallway light blew out. It didn't just burn out. It popped, spewing shards of glass like a grenade. The upstairs hallway was engulfed in darkness again, and that abyss looming over our heads, along with the sudden explosion, sent all my friends running out of the house. I didn't want to be alone in there, so I followed them into the front yard. When I joined them, they were all facing back toward the house with horrified expressions. One of them said, "Dude, look," and pointed up to the second story. There, in my sister's bedroom window, stood the silhouette of a person. They were unrecognizable, yet they had been in the room with me and my friend, in the house with all of us. while we were completely unaware for hours. We had no choice but to call the police. They searched the house but came back and said they didn't find anyone. They actually made me call my mom until she picked up and tell her what was happening, including what we'd been doing all day. Sure, I got in trouble with my mom and got scolded by a couple high and mighty cops, but none of that meant anything in comparison. Since then, we've never been able to explain what happened. My sister said she had no idea how her desk was covered in blood. She and my mom never saw anything else like it before or after, but I can never get it out of my head. None of my friends could either. We talked about it all the time, until we all moved on to different schools, different friend groups. My family eventually moved out of that house, leaving whatever answers it held behind. When I look back on the times my old friends and I used to hang out, I wish I could say I see us all playing Halo in my living room together. But instead, I see us standing in the yard in the dead of night, looking back at that figure in terror.